A single email about 50 million chickens just destroyed an entire country. You think I'm joking? I'm not. This wasn't a farming disaster. It was the secret code word for a $2 billion illegal loan, signed by Swiss bankers and military contractors, completely bypassing the nation's parliament. You might think this is just another story about corrupt politicians stealing from the poor. It's not. It is a story about how the global banking system is explicitly designed to let them do it, while top executives fail upwards. And if you have a pension fund, you likely paid for it. You effectively bought the chicken feed for a tuna fleet that is currently rusting in a harbor, having never caught a single fish. We analyzed thousands of pages of court documents from the Eastern District of New York and the London High Court to reconstruct the heist that triggered a sovereign default. But to understand how they stole $2 billion in plain sight, we have to look at the glitch that gave them away. A specific, typos-riddled email sent at 3 a.m. To understand the heist, you have to meet the architect. Enter Jean Boustany, a lead salesman for Prive Invest, a shipbuilding group based in Abu Dhabi. Boustany wasn't just a salesman. Internal banking reports later described him as a master of kickbacks. He didn't sell boats. He sold dreams to politicians who needed cash. In 2013, he landed in Maputo with a pitch designed to bypass every alarm bell in the global economy. The location was the Shadow Suite, off the books, away from the parliament, and deep in the smoke-filled logic of corruption. The pitch was seductive in its simplicity. Mozambique sits on the Indian Ocean, controlling a massive exclusive economic zone. Yet it had no fishing fleet and no navy to protect its upcoming natural gas fields. Boustany proposed a turnkey solution. Prive Invest would build everything: radar stations, interceptors, and a massive tuna fleet. But here was the hook that Minister Manuel Chang couldn't resist. The project was technically self-liquidating. Boustany claimed the tuna revenue would be so astronomical it would cover the loan payments and generate a surplus for the state. They called it pro indicus. It was a lie, wrapped in a sovereign guarantee. The feasibility study was absurdly thin. A few pages of projections claiming the fleet would generate $200 million a year from day one. For context, that's more profit than established global fishing giants make, with decades of experience. But the numbers didn't need to be real. They just needed to look real enough for a bank to lend against them. And Chang? He didn't care about the fish. He cared about the fees. The emails we uncovered show Boustany explicitly discussing brotherly gestures and consultancy fees, thinly veiled code words for bribes. To seal the deal, they needed to keep it secret. No parliament vote, no IMF oversight, just a signature in a hotel room that put 28 million people on the hook for a debt they didn't know existed. This is the critical weapon of the heist, the sovereign guarantee. By signing this document, Chang wasn't pledging the company's assets. He was pledging the tax revenues of the entire country. While the minister was signing his country's death warrant in Maputo, the real crime was being engineered 4,000 miles away, in Canary Wharf, inside Credit Suisse. The deal team was racing to close the Pro Indicus loan before the end of the fiscal year. But there was a problem. The bank's own diligence team had raised a massive red flag. They had commissioned a report on Prive Invest, and the results were nuclear. The report explicitly described the contractor's principal as a master of kickbacks and warned of a high risk of corruption. In a normal world, this kills the deal. But this wasn't a normal world. This was the era of too big to fail. The deal team, incentivized by millions in potential fees, didn't stop. They simply overruled the compliance department. The emails show them discussing how to manage the bad news, not how to investigate it. They sanitized the report, buried the warnings, and pushed the paperwork through. They treated the due diligence not as a safety check, but as an obstacle course to be navigated. The banker sat in his glass tower, looked at a document that screamed fraud, and stamped it. Approved. Why? Because the bank would make its money up front, while the risk was entirely offloaded to the Mozambican people. With the contract signed and the parliament bypassed, it was time to move the money. And this is where the heist becomes undeniable. In a standard sovereign loan, the bank sends the money to the country's central bank treasury account. The country then pays the contractor as the work is done. That is not what happened here. Credit Suisse sent the money directly to Privinvest in Abu Dhabi, $622 million, in a single wire transfer. It never touched Mozambique. It flew right over the heads of the Mozambican people and landed in the accounts of the man who had just promised 50 million chickens. The government of Mozambique now owed $622 million, plus interest. But they hadn't seen a single cent of the principal. They had bought a fleet of ghost ships they hadn't inspected, from a supplier who was paid in full, before laying a single keel. This wasn't a loan. It was a direct transfer of wealth, from the future of Mozambique to the private accounts of a few men in the desert. And once the tap was open, they couldn't close it. Pro Indicus was just the appetizer. Ematum and MAM followed, bloating the debt to $2.2 billion. The money didn't stay in Abu Dhabi. It was immediately atomized into success fees. This is where the email logs become surreal. They needed a way to discuss millions of dollars in bribes, without triggering automated banking alarms. So, they developed a glossary of farmyard code. $50 million became 50 million chickens. A fast payment was fresh poultry. Real estate investments were pearls. Jean Boustany, the master of kickbacks, coordinated this distribution with terrifying efficiency. At least $200 million was siphoned off immediately. $8.5 million went to the CEO of the corporate entities, $7 million to the minister's advisors. And yes, millions flowed back to the bankers in London who had signed the deal. It was a feeding frenzy. While they feasted, the clock started ticking on the loan repayment. The first payment was due in months. But the boats that were supposed to generate the revenue hadn't even been built. The self-liquidating project was about to liquidate the country. When the assets finally drifted into Maputo harbor, the scale of the deception became physically undeniable. Boustany and the bankers had promised a state-of-the-art commercial fishing fleet, capable of dominating the Indian Ocean. What arrived was a joke. These were not industrial trawlers. They were modified military interceptors from a shipyard in Cherbourg, hastily retrofitted with nets they couldn't pull, and cranes that didn't work. Independent experts later confirmed the boats were too small for deep-sea operations, and lacked the basic freezing capacity to store a commercial catch. 24 vessels, valued on paper at $850 million, were effectively useless plastic toys floating in salt water. And the absurdity didn't end with the engineering. The government hadn't even secured fishing permits. They had spent nearly $1 billion on a fleet that was legally forbidden from catching fish. So, the engines were cut, the crews were sent home, and the rust began to feed. The radar systems, the supposed shield of the exclusive economic zone, were incompatible with existing infrastructure, rendered obsolete before they were even switched on. The self-liquidating asset was rotting in the sun. For 3 years, the minister and the bankers managed to keep this $2 billion black hole off the official books. They buried the loans in special-purpose vehicles, effectively lying to the world. But, in the information age, you cannot hide a sovereign default forever. In April 2016, the House of Cards collapsed. Reports surfaced revealing the existence of the Pro Indicus and MAM loans, debts that had never been disclosed to the International Monetary Fund. The reaction from Washington was swift and brutal. The IMF, realizing they had been providing financial aid based on fraudulent data, immediately suspended its program. The World Bank followed suit. The G14 group of donors froze direct budget support. In the span of a single week, the financial lifeline of the nation was severed. The banker in London had secured his bonus, but he had just triggered a diplomatic nuclear detonation. The hidden debt was no longer hidden. It was the only thing anyone could talk about. The impact on the ground was immediate and devastating. As the dollars fled the country, the Mozambican medical entered a freefall, losing nearly 40% of its value in months. For a nation that imports its food and fuel, this was a death sentence. The price of bread doubled. Fuel became scarce. Medicine disappeared from hospital shelves. Inflation hit 25%, erasing the savings of the middle class overnight. The United Nations estimated that nearly 2 million people were pushed back into extreme poverty. as a direct result of this financial shock. While the salesman bought real estate in Beirut and the bankers bought ski chalets in the Alps, the citizens of Maputo were left to pay the bill. The Imetum fleet, now fully rusted and listing in the harbor, wasn't just a failed project anymore. It stood as a silent, oxidizing monument to a crime that had stolen the future of an entire generation. For years, the architects of this deal thought they were untouchable. They believed that because the victim was a developing African nation, the world wouldn't care. They were wrong. They made one fatal mistake. They routed the bribe money through correspondent banks in New York City. That gave the United States Department of Justice jurisdiction. On December 29, 2018, Manuel Chang, the man who signed the guarantees, was attempting to fly from South Africa to Dubai. He never made it. He was arrested on the tarmac in Johannesburg on a U.S. warrant. Days later, Jean Boustany, the master of kickbacks, was intercepted at JFK Airport. The indictment was unsealed, and it was devastating. It laid out, in excruciating detail, the emails, the wire transfers, and the code words, the chickens, the pearls, and the consulting fees. They were dragged into the cold light of a Brooklyn courtroom. The secrecy that was essential for the heist was shattered. The trial of Jean Boustany in Brooklyn was a spectacle of modern financial cynicism. Faced with the trial of Jean Boustany in Brooklyn was a spectacle of modern financial cynicism. Faced with the evidence of bribes and kickbacks, Boustany didn't deny the payments. He redefined them. He took the stand and told the jury, "I am a salesman. My job is to secure the deal." His defense argued that in the world of boat selling, paying officials is just the cost of entry. And shockingly, it worked. The jury acquitted him on technical jurisdictional grounds, ruling that while the crimes may have happened, they weren't the problem of a court in Brooklyn. Boustany walked free, but Manuel Chang was not so lucky. Extradited to the U.S., he faced the music, eventually being sentenced to years in federal prison. But individual prison sentences do not fix national economies. The bankers paid fines. Credit Suisse paid nearly $475 million to authorities. But this was a drop in the bucket compared to the damage done. The tuna bond scandal proved one terrifying truth. In global finance, you can rob a country, admit it in court. And if you have the right lawyers, you can still catch the flight home. Today, the Imetum fleet still sits in the harbor of Maputo. They are ghost ships in the truest sense, vessels with no crew, no fish, and no purpose. But they are heavy. They anchor a debt burden that will weigh down the children of Mozambique for decades. This wasn't a financial accident. It was a heist. It was a stress test of the global banking system. And the system failed. The safeguards were deleted. The parliaments were bypassed. The warnings were ignored. And while the lawyers argue in London and New York, the rust continues to eat away at the hull of the Imetum 001. It is a $2 billion lesson in what happens when you let the fox design the henhouse, or in this case, when you buy 50 million chickens and get nothing but bones.
One cigarette for the money, one cigarette for the fleet. The people get the hunger while we take the seed. 50 million chickens, that's the price of your soul. I'm digging the pockets, I'm taking control. It's good for the villa, it's good for the heights while you're down in the city.